thank you everybody for joining us here today in this latest Basis Technologies webinar in our ongoing series of webinars about all things relating to automation, agile, DevOps, testing in SAP. As you can see on the screen here, I'm sure you all know from the sign-up process, we're going to talk today about how automation can help us really to avoid change freezes, in particular during our S4 migration, our path to S4, and once we're up and running on S4 as well, so that we can accelerate that process and get the most out of that platform as quickly as we can without impacting the business too much. Little bit of webinar admin as always before we begin. Very typical on these things. Everybody on the call is on mute today, but if you do have any questions, we'd encourage you to enter those into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll take a look at those at the end. We're aiming to run for about, I think, 35 to 40 minutes today. We're not going to go too deep into anything technical, but yeah, if you do have some questions as we go through, drop those in the question box. This is a recorded session, as always, with Basis Technologies webinars. Many more you can view on our website as well. So we'll be sending out a link to this recording in a day or two, I expect, after this webinar. So if you want to get that to review it or to share with colleagues and you don't see it, do please get in touch. You can do that at our website, or there'll be some details at the end of this session. So let's begin. First of all, a couple of introductions. Of course, you can see us names and faces on the screen here already, but my name's Peter Yabsley. I'm the head of product marketing here at Basis Technologies. You may have heard me in these webinars before if you've joined us in the past, and I spend quite a lot of my time talking to our customers about how automation is helping them to overcome some of the challenges they face with software development and delivery in SAP. And one of those topics obviously is making that move and planning for that move to S4HANA. More importantly, I'm very happy to say that I'm joined today by Jim Duggar, our technology evangelist, who's joining us from our office over there in Dallas, Texas in the USA. Jim, thanks for joining us today.
And it is a beautiful morning here in the fall in Dallas, so glad to be here as well.
And Jim has many, he won't mind me saying, many years of experience inside and outside of SAP, helping, excuse me, developers and development community to adopt automation and new ways of working that help them accelerate delivery of software. Excuse me a moment. Okay, let's hope I can keep going. If not, Jim, it's all yours.
I'll take it if you just hold up your hand, right?
Excuse me, just one second.
I can probably grab the agenda while Pete gets a quick drink of water. So we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about the genesis of the change freeze, especially in SAP. That's really what most of the conversation today is going to be about. We're going to talk about how S4HANA can make that problem even worse. We see it certainly in ECC. It's a long-running issue, but with S4HANA, there are factors that create more opportunity for more drive and more demand for change freezes, making the situation more problematic. We'll then look at some automation techniques to be able to avoid this, to allow businesses to stay current and stay active, to continue to run business as usual as normal without needing to be able to have a production freeze. And Pete's going to take us through some real-world customer examples that have been able to solve this problem. We'll be happy to take questions about that as well. So let's dig in.
Thanks, Jim. I've managed to go slightly less red in the face. So let's move on. Hopefully, I can keep going. Just quick intro for the benefit of anybody who's joining us today who isn't so familiar with Basis Technologies as a company. Quick overview as to why we're here talking about this topic and why we regularly have these kind of webinars. We as a company create software automation that helps our customers, organizations around the world to change the way that they manage and maintain and adapt their SAP systems to support the needs of their business. And one of the ways we do that is by bringing techniques like DevOps and continuous delivery into those SAP environments through the automation that we provide, which comes in the shape of our DevOps and test automation platform, which is the most complete DevOps and test platform that's specifically engineered for SAP. That's the really important part here, of course, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the unique needs of those SAP environments. So we've been doing this quite a long time now as a company, founded in 1997. So we're nearly 25 years old now, and we have offices around the world. As I've said, I'm here in the UK today. Jim's joining us from the US. Also offices in Europe and Asia Pacific as well, because we have a base of clients all around the world. You can see some of the kind of organizations that we support on the screen there, helping them to get the benefit from automation in those SAP systems. So that's why we're here talking about this topic today, because we talk to companies on a regular basis. I'm sure a lot of you can imagine you're having these same conversations, these same thoughts about S/4HANA. So let's begin with the man himself, with Hasso Plattner, and something that he said a couple of years ago now. But I still really like this quote because I think it still speaks to a lot of the challenges that organizations are facing. And at the time, 2019, Hasso was talking about upgrades, and his estimation was that customers are on average, finger in the air, 6 years behind what SAP are offering them. And Jim, this is where I want to bring you straight into the conversation straight away. You're talking with people day in, day out. I assume this chimes with what you're hearing, and no doubt with what some of our audience are experiencing.
Yeah, I think it's pretty consistent with the true state of the SAP market and SAP customers. There's a couple of technical reasons why. One, if we look at the expense of maintaining currency with SAP's most recent release, this can be a very disruptive process. Sometimes upgrades are complicated. They require a lot of change, and so the effort to do that would not necessarily pay us a significant benefit. But even at the service pack level, they can introduce defects or introduce functional differences that are problematic for customers. And I think customers have also had an attitude that if it's not broken, don't fix it. That let's leave this very important system that runs our whole business alone as much as possible. As long as it's continuing to operate the business, it's not worth the risk of change in that environment. Now, we're going to get into a lot of the reasons why that is no longer an acceptable position to take. One, because of the change pace that SAP is introducing. Two, because SAP is no longer in the back office and completely isolated from the rest of the world. It's very frequently a system of record and a system of business process for external facing systems like web interfaces and mobile interfaces and these sorts of things. So there's all kinds of reasons why that can't be the case, but it unfortunately still is in many situations. So we've got to be able to solve for that.
So, thanks, Jim. So, I mean, obviously, there are technical challenges, and related to that, there are resource challenges and cost challenges around not just upgrades, but big SAP changes. And again, I'm sure our audience will be familiar with that. But one of the big drivers of, or limitations on change, is this idea that we can't hold back the business, and this idea that large amounts of SAP change mean a change freeze. So, how has this played out in your experience, and what's your kind of view of this idea of change freeze as a limiting factor?
Well, let's define change freeze to start, right? So the idea of a change freeze came to be a way to protect the reintroduction of defects or other adverse situation as the result of doing some kind of project in SAP, whether that be an upgrade, a migration, a consolidation, it didn't matter, right? During the course of the project, a customer would say it is responsible and smart to go ahead and prevent anything other than the most absolutely necessary changes in business as usual production to take place during the course of this project. That way, when we get to cutover, when we get ready to go live with this major project, this major upgrade, this major change, whatever we're doing here, we don't have to go back and reconcile a bunch of things that happened during the ordinary course of business in the existing production system right at the very end of things, right? And certainly we don't have to keep track of it during the course of the project. So this was the principal argument behind the change freeze. It's a reasonable safety argument, but as we've had a lot more demand for these types of changes much more frequently, as we're starting to look at supporting much more of the business in a programmatic fashion with SAP, I mean, there's a countless number of reasons why this is no longer a practical thing that one can do, especially not limiting the size of some of these projects, say like an S4 migration that might go on for years. You're not going to stop the business for years, right? So it's become an untenable situation in terms of a solution and an answer.
I think you've touched on a really important point there, because of course, maybe we could live with this and manage it better if we're talking about quarterly or biannual deployments of major new functionality in our SAP systems. If we're used to a slow cadence, but increasingly, that's not the case. It's not the case for most of the organizations we work with these days. And if you're delivering to production weekly, bi-weekly, even daily, how does change freeze fit in with that scenario, you know? So, but there may be, you know, there are organizations that are successfully up to date, that are current, that have managed to kind of work around this limitation. And they might be saying to you, Jim, well, that's all fine, but why don't we just do N+1? That's the historical way, right? Surely this is the solution.
Well, it is the solution, but it's not without consequences unless you have the right tooling around it, right? So if I look at any other environment that I have been a software developer in, they all have the concept of branch and merge, right? The idea that I would create a parallel track to create the next version, or a parallel track to try something that would be independent of what we call the tip or what's actually in production, that would be completely normal. And that mechanism does exist in SAP, and it's called an N+1 or a project landscape, and so on. And it's the right answer, but there's some real drawbacks to the way that it works in stock SAP and with stock SAP tooling. One of the primary ones is there's not a really elegant and efficient way to make sure that ordinary business as usual change actually gets reflected into the project landscape correctly. Anyone that's been through a retrofit cycle knows this pain and knows that it doesn't work quite like it should, right? So that needs to be solved. The systems need to be kept in sync, and there's a variety of other small technical issues that need to be solved for. This is the right answer, but out of the box, SAP doesn't have the right tooling to make it work smoothly.
And of course, you know, everybody on the call today will have their own view and understanding of this kind of situation in their business. But I mean, I was speaking to a company just the other day who are delivering literally hundreds of changes in their BAU environments every couple of weeks. And that's the level of complexity they'd be dealing with when trying to do these kind of big projects like these kind of S4 migrations. So that's what we're here to talk about. Sorry, Jim, if you've got something you want to add there.
Well, and I think you're adding on to this, right? And we're going to touch on this in a second, but we probably have multiple concurrent projects running now. If you're looking at BAU change of a couple hundred transports a week, which is completely ordinary in large environments, plus you're going to do an upgrade that might take you a month or two to fully test it and make sure it's ready. You might even have a concurrent project for an S4 migration schedule over a period of years going on. We might have multiple projects running concurrently. There is absolutely no way with all of this kind of activity, we're going to go to the business and say, we need to change freeze for each of these, right? Just reinforces the point, the necessary, the requirement to be able to do all of this work in parallel.
So of course, you know, this kind of situation we've described isn't actually unique to S4. There are numerous things that are, you know, special and unique about that big shift to a new technology platform. But let's talk specifically about, you know, the impact and the environment here in S4. I mean, I know one of the things and one of the sort of significant, I think, realizations in organizations over the past 2-3 years is that it's not a project to upgrade. You know, there's more to it than that. It's how do I get ready, actually, if I am going to do brownfield after all, which now so many of us think is a more practical option. It's do I move to the cloud first to get, you know, some of that value and return on investment more quickly. Then I've got to do my project. You've mentioned it might take years, and then we're going on from there. You know, how do you see this, and how are these conversations going when you're talking with the kind of people who are hopefully joining us on the call today?
Yeah, I think the question that I frequently get is, you know, how are we going to manage this? So let's look at what's coming our way. And even though we're really talking about S4 here, let's keep in mind that this slide is absolutely perfectly correct, except for one item for ECC. We've got service packs, upgrades, and those kinds of things for ECC as well. So as those come in, you know, how are we going to be able to upgrade our existing systems, make sure that they actually function like they're supposed to, get those service packs in place, provide the security updates, the things that the business needs to stay secure? How are we going to do that without asking the business not to make change during the course of that project? Let's say we want to move off hosted infrastructure on our own data center and move into an elastic environment like the cloud, right? Where we've got much more dynamic control over capacity and the ability to allocate systems. That kind of lift and shift activity, same thing. What are you going to do? Suspend all change during the course of the project. We've got the S4 migration itself, which is probably measured in years, not in maybe weeks or months. So it's completely impractical to even contemplate shutting down business change for that period of time, not to mention the whole reconciliation problem you're going to have with the brownfield migration between ECC and S4. And then, of course, our regular upgrades. And we're going to talk about this in a slide or two, but S4 has a much faster tempo than classic ECC has had, right? So if we're looking at telling the business, you can't have change when we're in the course of one of these projects, this is completely impossible. You're going to shut down ECC today, and you're going to say hello again to the business in a couple of years, right? Not a practical answer. So we have to have a good way of doing this. We know what it is. We're just going to have to get around some of the technical challenges that parallel capability is going to present to us. And then, of course, we're going to talk about that today as well.
And so I think you've summarized that very well, Jim. And of course, if we can try and get away from this idea of change freeze and manage the process more effectively, maybe we can focus on some of those more thorny questions around that technical migration. But let's pick up on that point about when you're on S4, when you're up and running. It's not over after cutover is a phrase that I've heard used. What's the new world of S4 when you're there?
Well, S4's tempo is much faster. I mean, it's every year to every 18 months for a release. This is valuable to the business for a variety of reasons. As I mentioned earlier, it brings defect support, it brings security support, and other important changes, especially as S4 systems tend to be more forward-facing than ECC was classically, that an organization should not ignore for operational security reasons. It also brings new functionality that better benefits the business, and so there's value in maintaining that. But then SAP itself has forced a little bit of a challenge on us, in that they're going to sunset these releases faster as well. So we have a responsibility of staying in support with SAP here. So all of that rather accumulates to a tempo of change that's much more quick, that we're going to probably have multiple concurrent projects running at any one time, and that we're going to be facing upgrades and change much more frequently than we have in the past, and simply cannot shut down the business for the course of all of those projects. So this is the fundamental problem with SAP and S4 in general, right? So we need to be able to solve for that. We need to be able to do this stuff in parallel to protect the business's ability to stay current and get the functionality that they need, even when we're doing these very complicated, in-depth projects.
And just for the benefit of anyone with us today who isn't on S4 yet, who hasn't gone through this, we were speaking to one of our customers the other day, and they've done an upgrade already. They're I think planning another. They said they expect it to take 4 or 5 months. So as Jim was saying, if that's an annual cycle or even an 18-monthly cycle, this change freeze challenge is present.
So I'm going to add a little more color to that and make it slightly worse even. We've actually had customers have to upgrade their S4 project environment during the course of the S4 migration from ECC, right? So even that kind of complication will exist because of the tempo of release pace here.
So let's talk about automation, and let's talk about some ways that it can help, and then we'll get into one specific kind of example of what we've talked about already. So how can automation help us with this kind of problem we've talked about so far?
So this is at a very high level, but it comes down to a couple of key capabilities that we need to make sure we enable. The first is truly parallel effort. I have to be able to service business as usual while I also achieve my outcome on the path of an upgrade, migration, whatever it is, major change, major project that I'm doing. Got to be able to do this in parallel because stuff is too long running to be able to shut down business change for the course of those projects. The second part of this becomes then, how do I ensure that I don't reintroduce a defect or an important change that I've made in business as usual because of cutover at the point of moving the changes, the project into production, right? We call this downgrade protection, but essentially it's making sure that everything is perfect, that you don't accidentally reintroduce regression or old code at the point of cutover. And then the final bit of this is the environmental sync. So in order to prevent these kinds of bad things from happening, how do I make sure that my project landscape and my BAU landscape stay in perfect sync throughout the course of the project, which may be fairly long running? Like we've talked about, upgrades are typically measured in the months, and migrations are typically measured in the years. So these three things are important things, and as it turns out, automation can comprehensively solve them and remove those complications from the project of doing work in parallel in SAP.
And as we said, the key idea here is, I mean, there are many benefits, but a key idea is get away from that change freeze. So I'm going to hand over to you for a few minutes to just take us through that path of what this could look like with automation that can help you to do it effectively, Jim.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the whole point of this approach is to be able to continue normal business as usual, support the business without any disruption to the way that they're used to us being able to support them as SAP professionals. But at the same time, achieve our upgrade, achieve our migration, achieve our release, be able to do the things that we need to do to bring that next major level of capability to the business, and of course, protect the business by keeping it current and on supported software. So let's walk through an example of how this might work and how we continue to do that and achieve that in SAP. All right, so those of us that have done N+1 projects probably know of a couple of challenges that come forth with them. The first is, how do I keep track of all the changes? I'm going to be making changes in my project landscape. I'm going to be making changes in business as usual. Maybe they're defects, maybe they're new capabilities. The point is, both tracks have to be kept in perfect knowledge and perfect sync throughout the course of the project. There will be times that I actually make legitimate change in true concurrency in both landscapes at once. An automation system needs to be able to perfectly identify those conflicts and prevent the accidental overwrite and loss of project work, while at the same time preventing the introduction of regression at cutover. So how are we going to keep track of those and make sure that neither of those consequences take place? But one of the easiest ways to avoid conflict in the first place is never get out of sync. So this idea that we are going to wait and do periodic retrofit cycles is inherently wrong-headed. It needs to be continuous, and both systems need to stay in perfect sync all the time. So let's walk through a situation where we do that and we use automation to manage these three challenges. I'm going to present a fairly simple project landscape and concept here. On the top in blue, we've got our standard production support track. So dev, QA, regression test or pre-prod, and then production. And what we've done is automatically provision a second environment, DV1 and QA1, to be able to do our upgrade or change, whatever project that we're going about. So the very first thing that needs to happen here is that DV1 and QA1 need to look exactly like production today. Well, automation can help us solve that problem. When we provision those, let's let the automation system know that this is actually a project track. It will look at the transport differences between everything and then create a relationship between production and DV1 to automatically and continuously make sure that DV1 always looks like production, so that all BAU changes are actually making it into our project landscape on a continuous basis, and we're starting from a known position of sync. After that, we can move forward with the next part of the project. The second thing that we need to do here is make sure that if we have any true concurrent conflicts, changes to the same objects in both business as usual and in DV1, that they are automatically detected and kept track of through the course of the project. Now, the classic tooling in SAP is cross-landscape object locking. That will fail you miserably here, and the reason why is it's not agile. After all, if I can't work on both of those at the same time, I don't have the ability to concurrently work in truly parallel tracks, right? So what we need instead is a way of letting us know that we are creating what's called a merge event later when we do cutover, but at the same time, allowing us to continue to work in parallel and move those changes forward in their respective landscapes without allowing overwrite or cutover to reintroduce defects or cause loss of project work. So that's the second thing that needs to happen. Moving into the third thing, let's say we've gone ahead and done all of our testing, we've done our development, and we're ready to move into production or cutover. So our project landscape will go ahead and release all of its transports to the regression stage point, where we can do a final user and integration test to make sure that everything is working just as exactly as it should. And this is where that cutover protection will be introduced. If we have any true conflicts that are left over, the system would automatically prevent those conflicts from moving into regression until they were properly resolved by the developers from both channels, BAU and project, to make sure that the right functionality is making it into regression. I'll add another fold here. Sometimes some customers will choose to take their existing production support dev and QA system and fold them into a role of now being the next project landscape, where now DV1 and QA1 become production support. You don't have to do it this way, but with the right automation and with the right dynamic transport path support, you certainly can. And it makes life pretty easy because now I don't have to retrofit my production support now becoming my project landscape. It's already in sync and it's all ready to move forward and support the business. And so finally, we will release to production. We'll have cut over, it will have been done safely. And if you haven't done that dynamic transport path swap, you would of course want to retrofit all of the changes from production that are now part of that new release and that new system into dev and QA and make sure that your production support environment is in sync. So what I want to really make a point of here is we created an opportunity to minimize the actual amount of time that the system was unavailable to the business or the system couldn't be changed to support the business. We did that by allowing business as usual to take place in a completely ordinary and normal fashion during the course of our project, which may have lasted weeks, months, or even years, right? And so this very much shrinks the amount of time that SAP is not available in an ordinary way to the business and gives us the advantage of being able to run multiple parallel projects without the conflicts and the complication that is traditionally associated with this kind of approach for managing upgrade and change projects.
Thanks, Jim. And before we wrap that up, I think there's just one thing I want to really highlight that you mentioned already in that process. I can imagine some people in our audience might be saying, yeah, but this is very simple, or we don't do it that way, or we've got 12 landscapes. You know, the point here is that with the right automation capability and flexibility, you can configure it in the way that you choose that suits your business, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not unusual for someone, for example, to release into production support dev. It's not unusual for them to not have a pre-prod environment. So all of those different possibilities are viable. And again, with the right automation, this might even scale to N+2, N+3, and you might even have multiple parallel landscapes where they all have their N+1s, and there's change going on concurrently in all of them. So that is completely ordinary in practice.
Okay, cool, thanks. So, and that brings us to the opposite of where we started. So what we're trying to create here is our warm, sunny business that is not frozen by our attempts to move SAP forward and give them more of what they need with that latest new functionality and new platform.
Absolutely. Nice picture of the beach too.
So Jim, we're not going to get into huge amounts of detail today, I know, but how can people achieve what you've just described?
Well, we work with customers all the time using our ActiveControl solution to do exactly this. So ActiveControl has all of the capabilities that we've been talking about in terms of automation to solve for being able to do this particular kind of parallel approach to upgrades or large changes. So it's completely reasonable in ActiveControl to expect it to automatically synchronize the project and business as usual landscapes. It is completely reasonable to think it will fully automate and control all the conflicts that may occur during the course of a project. It's also completely continuous, avoiding a lot of those conflicts in the first place, right? So one of the great things about ActiveControl is it removes a lot of the architectural constraints that have been historical in standard SAP and allows our customers to be able to do these highly automated, highly dynamic, highly continuous approaches to being able to support the business concurrently, as well as do projects at the same time.
And I just want to touch on the last point in this slide, because we might be talking about large amounts of planning, preparation, big teams, project work in order to get some of these S4 projects going, but we're not talking about, you know, months to get ActiveControl configured and in place to support that, right?
That's right. I mean, certainly all the dynamic transport things that we've been talking about, including the automated retrofit and these sorts of things, this is all drag and drop in the ActiveControl solution. So again, compared to stock tooling, it's really quite a level above in terms of elegance and ease.
And even, I think we've even had some customers, you know, might be up and running in a couple of weeks. So, you know, we're not talking about adding extra lift and heavy lift and overhead to those kind of projects that you're already trying to deal with and figure out.
Of course.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Jim. So let's, as promised, let's just round off with a couple of very brief examples of where we see this kind of thing in practice in the real world. And I wanted to start with this quote because I thought it might ring some bells with the audience, but I was talking to one of our largest customers actually recently, and we were discussing with them how ActiveControl could help potentially support their move to S4 in a quite big landscape. And they said, well, yeah, but the business is going to want us to make changes until the day before cutover. I think somebody even joked, oh, they're going to want to do it after cutover, you know. And of course they're, you know, they're having a bit of fun, but this is the sense of they're aware that this is what the business requires because they're depending on SAP and they're in a fast-moving environment and they can't afford to stop. And I think that's, you know, the context that we're increasingly talking in these days. So a couple of different examples here on that S4 journey. So this slide refers to a large consumer goods vendor that we work with in the USA, pretty big company, and they're really just starting their journey to S4. They're just going live, I think, with their first system or two, maybe next month or anyway later this year. But they have a quite large ECC or business suite estate. As you can see, over 20 production systems in different business units, and they typically use M+1 quite heavily to keep those systems as up to date as they possibly can, using automation to help them do that. And that's actually positioned them quite effectively to be able to start on that path to S4 in their migration, because they're pretty current and they're able to stay on top of a lot of the change that's out there, even while they're doing, as it says, a lot of complex BAU work. Again, we're in the hundreds of transports realm here, with some concurrent project work that Jim's talked about as well. None of that stuff has to be held up while they're doing the work to keep the systems current or implement updates or patches or upgrades. And you can see some of the kind of benefits that they feel they get from that on this slide here. I think the interesting one there is that they found their estimate was probably more than 90% of those changes when they have this kind of project work, whether it's moving to S4 or something else, can be automatically merged between the two tracks because they don't have conflicts, so they don't actually have to worry about it. They can trust the tool to analyze and tell them that that's the case. But when they do have conflicts, of course, they know about it. So that's maybe early in the journey. Slightly different example here is is Vistaprint, a company I'm sure many of you are familiar with in terms of what they produce, a kind of customized marketing materials mainly for organizations, you know, anything you want with your logo on it really. But that being their business, is very much a just-in-time kind of model because they can't stock basis technologies mugs, you know. So SAP is very crucial to their supply chain and servicing their customers, and they've used ActiveControl for some time to help them be more agile in how they do that, and they used it as well to support their move to S4 as part of that project. They took a slightly unusual, different approach. That's why I want to highlight it today than Jim was talking about, because they did choose a kind of a big bang cutover. So effectively, with of course a lot of testing, planning, prep work, and reassurance in place, but they basically switched off ECC one day and went to S4 HANA as a replacement. And as they were in that process of building those new systems, testing those new systems, planning for that, as you can see on the screen, ActiveControl was supporting that process in the way that Jim's described. And in that scenario, it was very much that, from ECC production into S4HANA development, mediated by the people involved to understand that process of what needed to go where. And since then, they have actually also used a multi-track approach with ActiveControl to upgrade those S4 systems, because they've been live for a little while now. So that's a second example. Finally, I'm just going to take a quick drink, excuse me. Finally, something a little more complicated. Sorry, excuse me 1 second. Something a little more complicated that Jim's already touched on. I'm not going to dig too much into the details of this, because we do have another webinar that goes into this in more detail if you're interested. But this is an example of a global consumer goods firm that really has, I've heard it described as the Champions League or the Super Bowl of S4HANA migration scenarios. Quite some complexity. Multiple ECC systems which are being migrated to multiple S4HANA systems in a staged process over a period of years, because the business is so big and so complex and SAP is so crucial. And at the same time, while they're doing that, as Jim has mentioned, actually being able to upgrade those S4 systems that have gone live but are still running in parallel to ECC, because they're able to manage and automate the delivery of change, get that visibility, get that confidence through having automation like ActiveControl, along with a number of other what they consider to be best of breed tools to help them accelerate that process and make it safe. So as I've said, lots more information available in a separate webinar on this one if you want to get into a bit more of the details. But again, slightly different scenario here. As Jim was saying, we're not going from ECC production to S4HANA development here. In this scenario, we've got the extra complexity of going from development to development and then having to manage those changes together through those landscapes. So really a lot going on in this example that automation has helped with. If we talk about outcomes, we've got a slide here that I often use. This is not about S4 migration. This is not about project work specifically, but these are the kind of benefits that our customers tell us that they get from using ActiveControl to automate change and manage these kind of projects within SAP. And these kind of outcomes can be expected and are just as applicable to big pieces of work in project environments as anywhere else. And particularly, I'd hone in on the reduction in manual effort, which is can be a big explosion in N+1 or N+2. Of course, we're accelerating the speed, and I would say the risk stat on this slide is probably a bit underplayed. I've spoken to a couple of customers very recently, Vistaprint being one of them, who said they're talking in the periods of years without any downtime due to technical problems, technical issues, because they've got ActiveControl to help them support and control that process. So you can get some real positives there from automation. So let's just wrap this up. I think we're just about on time. We started off by making this point that S4HANA migration isn't a one-stop shop. It's not a one project process. There are many elements, and because of that, we could be talking a really long duration, and that means in a traditional world, we might be talking significant change freeze, which simply isn't palatable. And particularly when you've gone live with S4, the story doesn't stop there, because there's more value to be had and there's more security to be had on a regular basis going forwards, but we need a way to deal with those upgrades and those updates. And as I've said, to do that, we've got to avoid change freeze. It blocks innovation, and it's just not tenable for the amount of change that we might be talking about in our S4HANA journey. So ActiveControl can help you to solve for part of that by helping you to avoid those change freezes and automate those N+1 or N+N processes so that you can focus maybe more on, as I've said, some of those more specific, tricky technical challenges around that move to S4, but it will also deliver you lasting value as you move forward through that migration into the upgrade cycle and into managing your SAP environments in a more automated fashion, and maybe with some of those ideas that we've talked about, like Agile and DevOps and continuous delivery as well. So that brings us to the end of today's session. I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us and remind you all that this is a recorded session, as I've said. So if you want to get a link to this recording, do watch out for that in your email. If you would like to discuss any of these topics in more detail to understand how we've worked with any of our customers on this topic of S4 migration, or understand more about what ActiveControl might be able to do in your business, do please get in touch with us. You can do that via our website, or Jim's email is on the screen there. If you'd like to ping him directly, we'd be more than happy to take some time to dig into this in a bit more detail with you in terms of both how ActiveControl can help with N+1 and S4 migration, but also the other areas in which it can help you by automating that development delivery process. Without further ado, let's just take a quick look. We've got a couple of questions that have come in, so we'll just take a quick look at those before we wrap up, because we're nearly on time for a change. Jim, we do have one that sort of relates to what I've just said. Someone has asked a kind of fair question. It's been a very focused webinar. What else does ActiveControl do, or what else can ActiveControl help with apart from N+1? That's not all it can do, right?
That's not all it can do, and if you want to stay on time, we certainly won't be able to thoroughly answer that question. ActiveControl is a full DevOps solution for SAP, so it will handle all of your tasks, so continuous integration, continuous delivery in the SAP environment. It supports both ABAP and anything CTS+. It has the ability to create very sophisticated managed workflows and provide very high degree of analysis and the prevention of technical defects, which Pete has hinted here as well. I mean, I'm just barely getting the skin off the onion here. So I would say, if you want to learn more about ActiveControl, more than happy to take you through it. Throw me an email, and we'll set up a time, and I'll give you a demo. In about an hour's time, I can take you pretty thoroughly through the solution.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Next one, I'll take this one briefly, because again, this is one that we could, I'm sure Jim, you specifically could spend a long time getting into, but the question is, you mentioned, I think we did briefly, some specific features to support S4 migration. What are they? So as I've said, we've got a webinar on our website that takes you through in more detail that more complex use case that I described, that will go through quite a lot of this. But at a high level, what's basically happening in that actual migration process is we're leveraging those existing N+1 capabilities that ActiveControl has, and the flexibility that it gives you to configure that, with a few extra features layered on top that help you deal with some of the specifics around S4. So for example, we're able to whitelist and greylist certain objects and types of change to define what can be moved where automatically between, for example, ECC and S4 during that process, and what needs inspection and manual input still to validate what's going on. We've got things like integration with, there's a product called Smart Retrofit from SmartShift, which is fairly widely used to accelerate the process of code remediation, to make those changes that you need to get things working correctly in S4. So we can build that into our process with ActiveControl. Even things like, as I've mentioned, if you've got that scenario where you do have parallel live ECC and S4 HANA systems, and you're not going from prod to dev, you're going from dev to dev, and you need to keep those in sync, ActiveControl is going to be able to do that across ECC and S4. So these kind of extra elements are being used by some of our customers to help them manage those scenarios. And of course, as I've said, giving you the example, maybe Vistaprint there are some more sort of traditional, more, let's call it standard N+1 scenarios where ActiveControl is helping anyway, without those S4 specific features. Jim, just one or two more. Let me read this. I think we've covered that one. Yeah, I think this is a valid question. We've been very blasé about change freezes in terms of getting rid of them. Someone has asked, well, why don't you still need some kind of change freeze for cutover in big projects? How do you respond?
I mean, roughly the answer is no, especially in terms of the change that we're talking about, which is ongoing functional change for the business, or defect support, or things like this. There is still an architecture question that is nonetheless part of this whole game, right? I mean, at some point, you've got to actually update the kernel on the servers that you're using, or do that underlying work. And unless you're in a truly HA environment with dynamic cutover, you're going to have a little bit of outage from that. But what we're really talking about here is not the infrastructure and not the lower level of the change, but rather how do we continue to support the business, keep it current, and not lock down regular, ordinary support that we're used to giving the business during the course of a long-running project. So I think I'll answer the question, no.
Okay, thanks, Jim. And there's just two more questions I want to get through before we wrap up. Apologies to anyone if we don't get to your question. We'll try and follow up offline. First one is just a little bit about integration. Someone has asked whether ActiveControl can integrate with Solman and Jira. Jim, perhaps you just want to touch on that topic briefly in this context.
So I would say integrations like that are perhaps the most common thing that we do in addition to deploying ActiveControl itself. It would be completely ordinary, especially in a more modern environment, to have, for example, changes to web, mobile, and other experience level applications depend on back-end services that ECC or S4 are providing through web services, RFCs, or other interfaces. And being able to coordinate that, we call this orchestrated release, being able to coordinate that across those two different platforms, and most importantly, probably integrate with not only backlog managers like Jira, which are making sure that both teams get the work on time, but also things like Jenkins or GitLab or these other tools that do CI/CD outside of SAP. That is all very much a part of the story of ActiveControl when we get beyond just conversations like this about upgrades and parallel change.
All right, great. Thanks, Jim. Right, there's just one more I want to cover because it may be in the minds of some of our audience who are still thinking about this journey to S4. Questioner has asked, how does ActiveControl fit if they choose RISE with SAP to support their S4 move?
The short answer is that ActiveControl is agnostic to methodology. We still have customers using waterfall for release planning. I don't advocate for that, but it works and it works just fine. But no matter the underlying methodology and approach that you want to use for managing your SAP releases or managing your backlog or managing the way that your team gets and works on work, we're going to have support for that. We can get into this in a demo, but we use a standard 3-tier organization of how we organize this kind of change and format it across releases. And it's very flexible to a given customer need.
And of course, the exception here is S/4HANA Cloud, which is the SaaS solution from SAP. And of course, in that scenario, we're not going to be talking about the kind of big customization projects, upgrade projects, and so on that we need automation to help us with, and is common in many of our customers because of the way they need their SAP systems to support their business, because in a SaaS solution, of course, that's taken care of elsewhere by the provider. So, of course, there's a few different flavors and there's a few different shades in RISE, but exactly as Jim has said, broadly speaking, I think for most of you out there, ActiveControl can absolutely fit in and support that journey, no problem at all. Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you very much again to Jim for your presentation and your Q&A there, and thank you to everybody for joining us here today. Do please get in touch, as I've said, if there's anything that you'd like to discuss further. But in the meantime, we hope to see you again on another Basis Technologies webinar in the future. So thanks again for joining us, and have a great day, everybody.